Welcome to DBC. Today we have a new book, which is Clean Language, Revealing Metaphors and Opening Minds by Wendy, Sullivan, and Judy, Rees. Before we begin, the structure today is going to be sort of 3 steps. We're going to talk about a few clean language questions, then the importance of metaphor and the importance of listening. So questions, metaphor, and listening. Before we hop right into that, I want to give you a little bit of a larger view of clean language. So clean language was originally developed by a New Zealander named David Grove, and it's a set, according to this book, it's a set of 12 questions which have been wiped of assumptions and metaphors from the questioner, cleansed, the idea of it being clean, as far as that it's possible. So clean language, according to this book, is not a persuasion tool, but it can certainly help you understand what will convince somebody or what is important to them. And this book frames itself as an introduction to clean language as well as being a workbook for beginners. And we're going to talk about that workbook aspect a little bit later. Really cool exercises in here. So to get started with the questions, there are 12 questions by this model of clean language that are combined with words that the person would actually say to you. So the first question is, and what kind of X is that X? And so the X here, it's going to be in all of the questions we'll find. That X has to be a specific word or words that the other person has actually used, literally used. For example, someone says, I have a headache. That would make question number 1. And what kind of headache is that headache? So we're inviting them to give us more detail about it. The image or the metaphor used here, or the term, is paraphrasing, as opposed to paraphrasing. In clean language, we don't want to kind of say what somebody told us. We want to say exactly what they told us. And so the idea of we're aware of open versus closed questions. The authors here frame clean language questions as being ultra open and free of prejudice and metaphor from the questioner. So that's the first question. And then the idea here is that we talked about the writing reflex before, and the idea here is that if someone says, oh, for example, I have a headache, clean language does not offer advice or a writing reflex or a prescription like, oh, well, you should take this pill or don't take that other thing or eat this or don't eat that. No, that's not it. What is offered in clean language are questions. And there's a metaphor here of getting a name and an address. So to get a name of what's going on, we ask the first question, what kind of headache is that headache? What kind of X is that X? Second question that they introduced early in the book is there anything else about it? Is there anything else about X? Which technically is a closed-ended question. So you could phrase that as, and what else about this headache? What else is there about this headache? To which they could say nothing. So it's technically a closed question, but it's still pretty free of assumptions from the questioner. And then, so that's how do you get the name, how do you get the address, and where is this headache? Or whereabouts is this headache? That's the introduction to the first 3 questions. So think of name and address. Now a little bit about metaphor. So the kind of the working definition for metaphor here is that the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. And they speak of the etymology. Metaphor comes from the Greek, and so meta meaning above, and then or over, and then for is using for carrying. So it's like to carry something over from one thing to another. And they say that actually in Greece, in ancient Greece, they had metaphor was like a type of a vase or a container to carry important things from one thing to another. So even the etymology of metaphor itself is a metaphor. Pretty cool. And there's a quote, and I want to read it to you from the English linguist Gregory Bateson at the beginning of the chapter. He's speaking about metaphor. He says, metaphor, that's how the whole fabric of interconnections holds together. Metaphor is right at the bottom of being alive. Now, if you were listening attentively there, you might have noticed one of the, or both of the 2 metaphors that are used in those 2 sentences. I'll read it again. Metaphor, that's how the whole fabric of mental interconnections holds together. Metaphor is right at the bottom of being alive. So here we have the idea of fabric, whether that be in the neural networks in our brain or just the structure of grammar itself being a fabric. And that metaphor is right at the bottom of being alive, a spatial metaphor, which is going to come up a lot more. So that there's this kind of foundation. So using metaphor. The metaphor for itself, again, excellent. So the idea here is that language is full of metaphors. And there are great exercises all throughout the book for how to listen to metaphors. We'll talk about listening a little bit more in just a second. But being aware of people's metaphors because they're always being used in media and in conversations that we have. So one very common metaphor are spatial metaphors. We always talked about the being at the bottom. But think about numbers. So the idea of prices being high or prices being low. Like they're not literally high or literally low. We just tend to think of numbers as being on either like a y-axis or an x-axis. And then the idea of time as well. So time, almost every language in the world thinks of the future as being in front of us and the past as, oh, it's behind me. It's not literally that. If you think about what's actually happened, like you turn around, there's no past there, but we think of it unconsciously in those terms. And the whole point of all this is that clean language is to keep our language as clean as possible by using the exact phrasing of the questions and then substituting the exact words someone else has used as those X, because we're using the other person's metaphor, which they're usually going to be giving to us unconsciously without really thinking about it. It just comes to them. And we do this because the most persuasive metaphors will be the ones that people give to us themselves, which again are going to usually be unconsciously generated. Now, given that, let's talk about listening a little bit. So since we're working with someone else's metaphors and that's the most important thing to them, it's 2 steps here. First of all, we got to notice it, which I think that's the more difficult one, and then recalling exactly what they have said. So the image here is that there's kind of a wall in between speakers, and that wall is made up of assumptions. And then over time, a clean language practitioner can actually become more aware of someone else's own metaphors and verbal tendencies and nonverbals as well than the person themselves, because we speak unconsciously, especially if it's in a native language or a language that we're fluent in. We don't have to think to speak. It just comes out. So the idea is to remove that wall of assumptions. And this is something that the originator of David Grove had originally talked about, because he was brought up Maori in New Zealand with other cultures as well. And so thinking about cultural assumptions that we make and how can we not impose on others. So a really cool insight from the beginning of clean language. So the idea here is, again, back to parrot phrasing. So we want to say exactly what they said, not kind of what they said. And to check the assumptions that we're making, either on a cultural or any number of levels, right? So one more, just to wrap up the video here, there's a ton. I really recommend the book because of the exercises and the workbook nature of it. So there's an idea of listening to a talk radio show or listening to a conversation 2 other people are having, and really tuning into the listening for metaphors and even listening for verbal pauses, which are words like so, you know what I mean, where there's essentially a comma that is being taken out and words are being used in its place. And I find this difficult. And the difficulty here is the tendency for us to be sucked in to people's stories, because there's something deep within us that resonates with stories. So I'm using tons of metaphors here as well, and they're all coming up unconsciously. And the challenge here is to separate ourselves from that stories and to listen in a different way. So to listen to the actual specific words that people are using, to really focus on the metaphors that they are using. So that is the end of the first one. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.